Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining everyone. We'll just give everyone a couple minutes to log on and then we'll kick it off. Feel free to drop in the chat your name, your position, where you're coming from. If you have similarly terrible weather as we do in Toronto this week. Okay. So Travis, I can't actually see the chat anymore. Oh, I lied. Never mind. Welcome everybody. Hey, Katie. Gross weather from Peter Row. Yep. Lorna, nice to meet you. Damn it. You guys always have nice weather over there. All right. Angela, hello. Thank you for joining us. We love Airdrie. Claire, hello. Very gross weather. Hey, Ashley. Hi, Nee. Thank you, Arda, who just signed on, our colleague. Helena, nice to meet you, so to speak. All right. Why don't we kick it off and we'll kind of go slow. Hi, Alan and Tyler. Nice to see you guys. Sault Ste. Marie. I'm heading there in June, Kara, so hopefully we can meet. All right. So today is about a guide to housing and homelessness projections, and we want to explain a little bit about how we do it. We've recently developed kind of a 2.0 of our tool. And then I wanted to actually kind of go through a fake community. So I did it yesterday and ran through some data of a community called Centerville, population of 50,000. And I wanted to show you how the scenario modeling tool works in actuality, what questions it can kind of answer. And I hope that some of the information we provide doesn't allows you to kind of make some of your own math and assumptions and tools if you're investigating the projection modeling yourself. If you're not, then also happy to kind of talk about what tool we have as well, but it should be useful for everybody. Okay, so today's goals will outline the problem that we're trying to solve with the projection modeling tool. I'll provide an overview of the tool and the components. So not just kind of our tool, but the components that go in it. And if you're thinking of doing similar things yourself, that part's going to be really useful. And then we're going to go through Centerville, and I'm going to show you different scenarios and how I used the tool relatively quickly over kind of a few hours last night to investigate different parts of Centerville's homelessness system. All right, what's the problem? So I think as everyone on this call, I'm sure knows, is homelessness and housing is an incredibly complex issue with huge expectations and constraints, and everybody and their dog has a solution for it. And that's not to say that those solutions aren't well-meaning and helpful, but when you're getting significant public pressure, or I know there's a lot of municipalities on the call, municipal government, local government pressure to do certain things, to try certain things, to see certain results, what we've found in working with kind of our municipal partners as well and our nonprofit partners is that it's really difficult to show what the consequences of some of those choices are. And sometimes they're bad choices, and you may know that based on your expertise, or sometimes they might actually be great solutions, but without kind of the data or the system to say, what if we did this? It's difficult to know how those play out, and it's difficult to have kind of an evidence-based discussion at the local level. So like I said, without evidence, difficult to know what's right. And it's also when something's not right, it's really difficult to show it because we all have preconceived notions of how best to end homelessness or what we expect certain things will have an outcome on in the community. The second thing in government and nonprofit, if there's no dollar attached, it's nearly impossible to plan for. And I think sometimes it still seems silly we have to attach a dollar because we just need more housing, way more housing. Doesn't matter how much it is, way more. But without that actual figure, it's difficult to have planning discussions. So our scenario modeling tool and scenario modeling in general, projection modeling, I'm going to use those kind of interchangeably. Doesn't solve that problem. It doesn't make homelessness more complex, but what we've tried to do is create a tool and a system to test those assumptions, understand implications, and kind of unearth, if you do this, how might you expect the outcome to be? Systems planning 101 for my homeward trust people on the call. Nice to see you. You guys know this better than anyone. But systems planning it was very in vogue, I would say kind of 10 years ago, in part created by Dr. Stephen Gates and Dr. Lena Turner, our co-founder. But really, I want to bring it back as a concept for this. And it's simple. It's 4 concepts. So systems design, that you take a structured approach to designing a system that efficiently reduces homelessness. And there's a whole bunch of factors that are at play, whether they're macroeconomic factors or program efficacy factors that are going to create the result that you see day to day. Program interaction is that within the system, there's various programs that are going to respond to either help or hinder your progress to ending homelessness and housing stability, and that these don't operate in isolation, and how they interact throughout your system creates massive differences in your overall outcomes. Balanced solutions that within that portfolio, you need to figure out where to invest more, where to invest less, and how to move those levers as things change, just as a business would. Charlene, I see you have your hand raised. I just want to make sure, can you hear okay? There's no technical issues? No, maybe it's a rogue hand. The team can help you in the chat. And then the last one is resource alignment. So that depending on that mix that you need, and that changes frequently based on all those other factors, how do you best target resources? And that's a decision that needs to be made quarterly, not sort of on even an annual basis. So how do we approach the problem? We don't have the tools. We don't always have the tools we need. We don't always have the data we need. What are the ways that we can start testing these assumptions? If we think about a continuum of complexity, on the left-hand side is back of napkin estimates. So when you get your council requests, you get your board requests of how much money we need to do X, you pull out the notepad, you pull out the Google sheet, and we do that all the time. There's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes that's not sophisticated enough. Often it's not sophisticated enough to kind of accommodate the complexity of something like homelessness or housing. On the right-hand side, there's the kind of sophisticated machine learning models. So those are predictive algorithms. We used one, if anyone's familiar, in the recent AMO project, where we projected out what homelessness would be over the next 10 years in Ontario based on different economic upturns and downturns. Those are great. We often get people coming to us asking for that sort of thing. There's several issues though. One is they're expensive. 2 is they're complex. They require a ton of data. And 3, they're not often usable in perpetuity for you on the call. So if you invest in kind of a sophisticated machine learning model, if you even have enough data to accurately predict, then you're not able to update as you get new information, as council asks for new questions, as media asks for new questions, as you want to test where to put resources. So the thing that our data science a data scientist, manager of data science, and myself, based on kind of years of Alina's work too, was how do we create something in between? And so what I'm going to refer to as projection modeling, it's more of a calculator. It's based on logic, it's based on assumptions, and it combines that back of napkin easy estimate with more sophisticated math, essentially, in order to come up with a tool that allows you to systems plan on a more iterative basis. The great thing about this, it's customizable. So on the right-hand side, not customizable. You can't change different factors. The middle part is we wanted something that was going to be highly customizable to almost any circumstance. All right, so what is it? It's a structured way to explore how different decisions can shape homelessness. It's not a prediction or a plan. And sometimes when we work with communities, there's several communities who have adopted this, particularly in Ontario. And that's like a stumbling block for us, is that this is not meant to predict the future. It can't. No model can. But what it's meant to do is be flexible enough that we can run enough iterative scenarios that'll help you plan good and bad throughout the coming years. It allows you to also simulate different scenarios, and that's particularly important, not only in the planning, but in the advocacy piece. And any kind of municipal government representatives, when you're working with council, this is particularly effective to say, we can do it all, but here's the kind of expected outcome if we were to do those things. It's a logic model. So if this happens, then what? And what we've tried to do is give end user ultimate control over what inputs go in it. And then we've taken kind of our years of systems planning, systems design work, as well as the data work to build in some of that back end math, essentially. Okay, principles. Anyone on this call who is in housing and homelessness, this will be very, very familiar, but the whole tool is based on the concept of inflow and outflow. So inflow is the people at risk of experiencing homelessness who are coming into your system to access services, whether it be your homelessness system or your housing system. Your homeless serving system is a mix of people, resources, finance, policy decisions, infrastructure, and in that service system, you decide your scale, your performance, your mix of programs. On the right-hand side is your outflow. So successful reductions to successful homelessness reduction. So people exit out of the system and hopefully permanently stay out of that system, or they return back into homelessness. And so the entire tool, for those less familiar on this call, is predicated on this stock and flow, inflow and outflow concept. What we're trying to do in both the at risk of experiencing homelessness part and the experiencing homelessness part is get it so our net inflow, the number of people coming in, at least equals or approaches our net outflow. That's very difficult to do with at risk of experiencing homelessness, given the kind of size and scale of the systems. But for experiencing homelessness, what you might hear that is kind of ending chronic homelessness, means people aren't sitting in your system, because as people coming in, same amount are coming out, and people are moving through your kind of crisis response. Why I like showing this because, and one of the kind of key parts in the model that we wanted to accommodate or for include, is that so much of what impacts housing and homelessness and housing and homelessness outcomes, of which municipalities and different levels of government have different accountabilities depending on where you're on the country, is a lot of it you can't change, either as a nonprofit at the local level or as a service manager, say if you're in Ontario. So that inflow, there's low influence. That's driven by population growth, that's driven by economy, of course, conversations around tariffs and not knowing how that's going to impact affordability. Vacancy rates, very difficult for you to control at a local level. Health policy, child and welfare policy, social assistance rates, which are sort of the biggest driver of inaffordability among people with disabilities, but also not in work. And so we tried to create a tool that will allow you to model your response to those without saying that you have any impact on what those would be. In the middle, that's where your response influence, depending on who's on the call, but municipalities who have mandate for homelessness and nonprofits have high influence. The choices you make in there have huge impacts on your outcomes. And when I show you the Centerville example, you're going to see how small changes in performance make a difference of like not ending homelessness to ending it over the course of a couple of years. And then outflow. You can't move people to spaces that don't exist. And so there's medium influence and outflow. And of course, we can't build at a local level or nonprofit level to the extent that's needed really to meet demand. So it's a medium level of influence, but you also can shape long-term exits by, with the resources you have or with the advocacy resources you have, making sure that the types of spaces that you need in your system are being built. So for example, if you need deeply affordable housing and your community, your municipality, or your advocacy is pushing for affordable without a clear definition of what affordable is, you might get a bunch of, I don't know, slightly below market rate housing. Well, this tool is going to show you quickly that that's actually not going to help, or it'll help a certain segment, but it's not going to change the day-to-day impacts of housing and homelessness instability that people see day to day. So whereas a sophisticated model, the math model, would model the economy, it would model population growth, which of course we've done. We're not trying to do that in this tool, and it's not even necessary, in my view, for you to do it. You're modeling the response to these factors and testing, if your population grows, how can your system absorb it? If the economy worsens, what can be your response. And so it doesn't assume an impact, but it really just focuses on the things you can control and how that'll change that inflow and outflow, and then the overall numbers. All right, so this is our tool. We could have built it in anything. And Dee and I, after much discussion, said, let's build it in Google Sheets because that's the thing that's most accessible to everybody. Most people have Excel and it's highly flexible and not as dependent on us and kind of maintaining it. And so it really gives communities a great deal of control. What it does is tracks how people move in and out of homelessness. It also tests the effect of different program type scales and mixes. So because we kind of built it in this flexible way, you can apply any definition to homelessness you want. You can add any program you want in here, as long as you understand the rules and the assumptions of how that program works and how it interacts with the system. And of course, that's sort of D&I's expertise to the communities we work with, our partners, to say, let's make sure your system is accurately reflected in this. One of the great benefits, I think, is it shows what happens if you change nothing. If you don't do anything business as usual and you keep your system as is, which some communities are facing because of a lack of resources, it shows you what the expected outcome will be. It also shows what happens if you do. And I was in a meeting one time with a CAO, and I had done I think I had done a scenario that was stabilization. So it was a fairly large investment, and it essentially showed over the next 10 years, homelessness would increase and then it would come back to about the same levels as it was today. And they aptly said, we're going to do all that work just to get back to where we are today. And I said, yeah, and you're going to wish you were back to where you were today. And so that was a really powerful moment for everyone to calibrate expectations on the need to build and the need to continue to build and be responsive. And without kind of that chart, which I'm going to show you some of those, I don't think that conversation would have been as impactful. It also helps you identify where systems get stuck or start to improve. One of the neat things we also were able to incorporate is where your system gets overloaded. Or not overloaded, where your system, you're overbuilding your system. So if you're successful in reductions of homelessness, your emergency shelter, for example, can come down. You can see in the tool that by maybe year 7, you're at 342% of your needed capacity for emergency shelter. That allows you to start adding in the tool different conversions to other spaces. So maybe you take those emergency shelter spaces, you turn them into transitional. I'll show you more about that too. And then connects investment to impact and when change actually begins. And so one of the most important things is the time to change aspect. So when we bring spaces online within this tool, there's not a delayed, but there's an appropriate and realistic inflow, the impact into the system. And so we're not just standing up 40 spaces and expecting that 40 people are housed. So we've tried to accommodate some of that real world practicality as much as possible. Okay, this is where we're going to get technical, but I'm doing it in hopes that if you were doing something similar, this will be valuable to you to think about what concepts you want to include, because Dee and I went through hundreds and back and forth for hours and hours. And so these are the ones that we think had the greatest impact on the model without making it overly complex. These will also help you when we look at Centervilles. So experiencing homelessness, if you see EH anywhere, that means the known population currently without stable housing. We could choose to model hidden homelessness as well. Right now, we're just modeling known population. That means they're touching the system. The tool, you can apply any definition you want. We also have at risk of experiencing homelessness. And so you can decide how you want to define that. In the last few I've done, I have used core housing needs. So the percentage of population, either inadequate, unsuitable, unaffordable housing. And so what percentage of the population at any given time is at risk of homelessness. We also have a growth rate for demand section. So that's the projected increase of that's projected increase in the community of growth overall, and then how that specifically impacts the number of people experiencing at risk of homelessness over time. And then conversion rate. So what percentage of people at risk of homelessness transition into experiencing homelessness every year based on systemic factors and intervention? So that's an input. When we set it, I usually set it at 2%, but you can change that input. And that's really to represent not everyone at risk of homelessness needs housing. Not everyone at risk of homelessness is going to become homeless. So what percentage on an annual basis do you believe are going to convert from at risk of homelessness to experiencing homelessness? And really, given the limited finances available in housing and homelessness, we're not able to solve for that whole at risk. And of course, I believe in prevention, but really what we're trying to do is keep people up into at least the at risk, hopefully more housing stable, to prevent that inflow into homelessness. Self-resolution rate, this is something we applied later on, but it had huge impacts on the system. What we know from research, and of anyone from Reaching Home on the call, I think you guys have that research too, is the percentage of people who exit homelessness without formal intervention is high. So people often, family and friends, able to help. So they may never touch the system, or they may not need a housing space within the homelessness and housing left-hand side of the continuum. And so you can play with that. If you think your system is healthy and functioning, you can increase that self-resolution rate. If you think there's a lot of constraints in your system, there's terrible affordability, there's certain factors such as substance use or mental health that are really impacting, you can reduce that self-resolution rate, and it has huge impacts on the model as well. Acuity mix. So what we have is also, you can put in the distribution of needs. I actually added a fourth level of acuity. So it's very high, medium, low, and that's to represent some of the kind of escalating challenges within complex needs in community. So you can say, I think X percentage of my experiencing homeless population is high needs, and X percentage is medium, and X percentage is low. And that allows you to see when certain program types are over or under subscribed for acuity. And then the model also tracks with or without intervention. So it calculates what the estimated demand for services would be with the supply that you have, and also without. Then program factors. So this was a doozy. One of the things we had to really think about is each program has a set of factors, and those factors change how it interacts in the system. And not everybody's shelter looks like everybody else's shelter. So for example, in some communities, transitional housing, which is sort of medium-term housing for people who are not in the sector, I would classify that, and who cares what I think, but as housing, as not as housing. That's not permanent housing. It's usually 1 year, but sometimes it could be up to 5, 6. Other communities, some communities classify it as housing and some don't. So we need to understand how that program thumbprint, or footprint rather, maps onto the system so that we're appropriately changing that supply and demand. And that's one of the cool things we were able to kind of figure out here. So program factors, the number of spaces available in different housing and support programs. If you're a systems manager, or if you're part of a large nonprofit, this is the number one thing you need to know. This is the most important. Developing an inventory is the secret to unlocking this. And an inventory you can't estimate. You really need to know what those spaces are and what program they belong to. Length of stay is also hugely important. And sometimes when we don't have it, we apply what a length of stay should be. But that's the average time a person remains in a program. That's essential to your supply, because if you have high length of stay, that means fewer people are going to rotate through that program. Your turnover is going to be less. Also, if you have low length of stay, though, that might not be good. It might mean more people are exiting into homelessness because they're not staying as long as they should in a particular program. So that's one of the really important parts of an inventory that we use. Turnover, I explained that, how many spaces become available and how many people can be served annually. Positive exits. So we use both positive and negative exits depending on the program. A positive exit means an individual transitions out of experiencing homelessness or out of at risk of experiencing homelessness into housing. What that means in the model visually is they're off your demand map. Your demand goes down. Negative exits are when an individual leave a program, but they return to experiencing homelessness. So that means they're coming back into the pot, if you will, not to be sort of facetious, which doesn't kind of reduce your demand. And then new spaces committed and unplanned. So what we were able to add is sometimes you have spaces that are coming online 2, 3, 4 years from now, and those are paid for, or those are budgeted for. We need to distinguish between those and what the new spaces and the new money are, and you need to be able to kind of clearly delineate between them. Operational costs. So we work with communities to figure out what an appropriate operational and capital cost is per type of space. Sometimes we use real data, but sometimes they might say, yeah, our operational cost for supportive housing is, I don't know, $50,000 a unit. And that's not enough because we're not able to support high acuity individuals. So we might actually increase that operational cost beyond what's actual in order to kind of model a more realistic scenario. The thing is, when you take all of these together, there's sort of infinite number of levers and possibilities you can combine. So these are some scenario combinations. I'm not going to go through them in detail because we're going to send this piece to you, but you can model what would it be if a low cost system, if we have no money, what would it look like and what would be the outcome? What would it look like if we change the program mix? What would it look like if our population explodes? So here are 3 kind of common questions that it's less complex than looking at these scenario choices. What happens if our community's growth rate explodes? What is the consequence of no new investment? That's fine if we can't invest money, but if we can't, what does everyone need to understand, eyes wide open in this community, in this local government, in this nonprofit about what we can expect? And what if we change our prioritization criteria? So one of the interesting things we have on the model is each program type, you decide which population it's targeting, or you can split it. So is it targeting people at risk of experiencing homelessness, or is it targeting people experiencing homelessness? And how do those decisions change what the outcome will be? Then you can get more complex, and I'll send this to you. But complex scenario would be, what happens if we have low investment and we only focused on emergency response rather than long-term housing solutions? We're going to assume that growth in homelessness is high because there's worsening socioeconomic, and that there's an increasing share of people who are experiencing high acuity needs. I'm sure I just described for some of you your exact situation in your community. We're going to assume a moderate level of effectiveness and performance, expected positive and negative exit rates, and that both operational and capital costs need to be kept low, and we're going to prioritize crisis response. These are the type of scenarios that you, I'm sure, are being asked to kind of show every day or prove why they won't work. And it's really just a combination of these different things, which is all kind of available in the tool. If you build something yourself like this with some of these assumptions, you can run that same kind of thing. Okay, limitations, and then let's go to Centerville. So it's not predictive. It doesn't predict the future. It really is meant to be an engaging, ongoing tool, not a this is the definitive answer of what is exactly going to happen. The results are only good as the data provided, but really what we've been able to do is come up with some kind of averages and some proxies and some ways to get around the data quality. So I would just caution you that you really don't need perfect data to do this type of thing. It's better to start doing it than waiting for perfect data. It doesn't address some complex factors. If aliens come down tomorrow, I can't accommodate for that in the tool, and neither could you. But it does allow you to kind of keep exploring as you learn more. And of course, it doesn't replace expertise, your expertise, human expertise, lived experience, and what people are experiencing on the ground. Okay, let's go to Centerville. So starting population, it's about 51,000. I said in the tool that they're experiencing modest current growth, projected to reach medium high growth over the next 10 years. In their housing and homelessness system, they've got 500 units of deeply affordable. So we'll say they're in Ontario because that's the only community, I think only province has mandate for community housing subsidized. They have 25 emergency shelter spaces, 15 transitional, 5 supportive housing for high and medium acuity individuals, and about 150 people known to be homeless annually. There's also a low self-resolution rate. So there's not a lot of places to go, and we're assuming people won't have the resources to positively exit out of homelessness. They've also got in my model about $500,000 per year in prevention funding. They're also a beach town on this rainy day. The continuum I chose, and for the kind of the sake of this demo, is prevention and diversion, emergency shelter spaces, transitional, so longer term, 1 to 3 years, supportive housing 1, which is a very high acuity model, supportive housing 2, which is a high medium acuity model, and then deep subsidy housing, highly affordable subsidized housing. We're not talking about fake affordable. All right, let's go through it. I'm going to try to go through it slowly enough for it to make sense. So the first scenario I ran in Centerville was business as usual. So no policy changes, no investments. They just have the same supply I showed you before, maintaining current service levels, and they have gradually worsening housing supply and affordability, but I didn't make it too extreme. So what we can see based on that model is that they would go from 150 people experiencing homelessness under these conditions to an estimated 220 individuals. That's what you're viewing here. At risk of experiencing homelessness, you see is following a population growth and the multiplier I put on what percentage of people would be experiencing a risk of homelessness. So this is the, if we do nothing else, this is what we might expect to be happening. You can see that this is a fairly conservative estimate over 10 years. Moderate increases in acuity levels. So within the model, it showed they would go from about 8 to 22 individuals experiencing high acuity, and in the lowest acuity category, 53 to 77. So again, I made this really conservative. You can make it more aggressive based on kind of what your scenario is. And here's the inflow outflow. So we can see, as we saw before, really simple math, more people at risk of experiencing homelessness come in as the population grows, and we estimate a higher percentage are going to experience homelessness. And then we have a flat outflow. That's because we're not building any more new spaces, and the only space that's supporting the at risk of experiencing homelessness is a portion of the deeply subsidized housing. On the right-hand side, you can see similarly, as population goes up, as we have conversions from at risk experiencing homelessness to homelessness, that's going up with a static outflow because we're not building any more spaces, we're not changing performance. It will continue to worsen as time goes. So what happens if we do the wrong thing? So Centerville, they're experiencing 150 people experiencing homelessness. They're concerned about community impacts, individual and family trauma. So they say, you know what, brilliant idea. Let's double the shelter capacity. We've got 25, let's make 45, let's make 40. And that's gonna kind of solve our problem. So this assumes a significant expansion of shelter space, prioritizing immediately crisis response, and no other changes to the system. We keep everything else constant. What you can see is we actually go from 150 individuals to 181. And that makes sense. When people are in emergency shelter, what I said for this program was that doesn't count as housing. It has an average length of stay of only 4 months because it's meant to be short term. And 95% of the people who are in shelter are negatively exiting back into homelessness. That's how the shelter is supposed to operate. So that's not a knock on Centerville's shelter. So we see high acuity again increases 8 to 18 and low acuity 53 to 64. We also have at risk of homelessness increasing. So we've managed maybe visible homelessness. We've kind of overbuilt our system, to be honest. You don't need that much for 150, but we've also not addressed the inflow. And so when you see these side by side, it might feel like a good idea to build a bunch of shelter space, but we're going to see over the long term that it's not going to have the impact that I think we're all hoping for. And then here you see it go down because the shelter has that, it's basically supporting 5% each year to get back out. So you see a little bit of a reduction, but when your population grows, you're seeing that come back up. So why is this happening? We can say there's a significant deficit in options for people with high acuity needs because the shelter we've set as taking 0% of people with high acuity needs. And the shelter capacity doesn't address emergency supports for that population. So I ran another scenario. I said, what if we didn't build so many shelter spaces? We do need some. So we'll build 10 spaces alongside an increase of transitional housing and supportive housing options to try to address that high acuity population I could see in my model wasn't being supported at all. Added 10 transitional spaces with an average length of a year and a half. I added 5 and 5 with an 8-year average stay. That's really long, but I said, I want to build a program where people can stay, get the supports they need, and aren't coming back into homelessness. And it aims to balance the crisis response with longer term stability. What we then see happen is a much different curve. So as we bring those spaces on in year 2 and 3, we see this start to come down. Compared to our doubling shelter, that looks a lot better. So we're actually building, I think, the same number of spaces, maybe a tiny bit less, and we're seeing a slightly better, well, fair amount better result. So this provides the ladder for individuals based on acuity. So people with high acuity are getting into housing. That's what you're seeing there. But then what you're seeing here is because we haven't built that longer term, deeply affordable housing, as your population, as Centerville's population is going back up, what we're seeing there is we're starting to hit that curve back up. So what we know is that's great. Building these 40, I think, spaces is a better outcome than just putting all our money in shelter. But if we don't keep a bill through year 7, 8, 9, 10, we're going to start to lose traction as our population grows. Oh, I spoiled it. So the reason why you see that that similar increase is we'll look at the at risk of experiencing homelessness line and the doubling shelter line. They're the same because we haven't built those spaces that are targeted at people at risk of homelessness. So of course, at some point in time, that number is going to start to go back up as that at risk of experiencing homelessness continues to convert into experiencing homelessness annually. So let's build housing for people at risk of homelessness. So what I've done here is I said, let's keep everything else the same, but let's add an additional 75 units of deeply affordable housing. That's not huge in their portfolio of 500 already. So we're just adding 75 units as a modest increase. What we say is 70% of those units in our prioritization criteria are going to go to individuals at risk of homelessness. That's a choice. And that's not how community housing lists are necessarily built right now. So I'm going to say most of this deeply affordable housing needs to go to people experiencing homelessness, but 30% are going to go to those at risk. And that's going to stem some of my inflow over time. I'm assuming a really positive length of stay, 12 years, and an average household of 1.8. So of course, families are staying in it. But what I'm saying in my system is that I need for Centerville smaller units, bachelors, one bedroom apartments for individuals and couples, because that's who's sitting in my experience homelessness population. Way better. So what we can see here is only with an addition of 75 units, we're decreasing the inflow, which is having big outcomes in our outflow as well, or experiencing homelessness. And then you can see in tranches. So as we've built, I think I divided it out here, 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 we can see those tranches of kind of a dramatic reduction. So then we get down to 69 individuals. But then I said, what if we improve how the system functions? So you remember there's kind of multiple levels of concepts of performance within the model, but one of the main ones are positive and negative exit rates, length of stay, and then self-resolution. So are people staying where they need to? Are they going to the right spaces? Are we able to provide the support so that they're either exiting to housing or staying put in a positive space? So what I did was I just moderately increased the performance. So I declined the negative exits, I increased the positive exits. And what happened was, there you go. That's your high performance. Again, I didn't make it unrealistic. So ideally, if the system was performing as is, with no new money, you could go from an outcome that looks similar to this to something like this. Now, I'm weary of kind of this scenario because I appreciate in most systems, there's no more efficiency left to give. But it does show you why small things in a smaller system, such as exit rates, can have a huge impact on your overall success. And just to show you there, this is your inflow outflow, looks really similar, but what you're seeing is because of the improved performance in community housing and supportive especially, you're seeing a greater outflow experiencing homelessness, which is overall decreasing your numbers. Then I think it's the last one I did, I said, okay, well, what if there's a 2-year delay? What if council, what if board thinks all of this is a really great idea, but it's going to take 2 years longer than we think to build this? So what you're looking at is the deeply affordable high performance. You can see we have capital coming online at 2, a huge investment in year 3 with a big in 5 and 7. What I did is I shoved everything over 2 years and said, what would happen if we had a longer time to change? So we see still a pretty good impact. So that's your deeply affordable. This is your 2-year delay. So because we're not racing ahead as fast of the population growth as we are here, we don't have quite the same outcomes, but they're pretty close. But the big thing is the modeling allows us to see this. So if we say, okay, 2-year delay is what we're going to have to go with, we also can look at these two and say, how do we prepare our community? How do we prepare our council for things not looking as they might think they should in the next few years? How do we minimize the harm in this kind of yellow circle while we get to some of these reductions we want to see? So again, then this tool becomes a planning tool, advocacy tool, communications tool, so people know what to expect. I didn't talk much about cost, but I did want to show you the kind of difference between 3 of the scenarios. So we added 40 in the doubling the shelter capacity scenario. We added only 30, excuse me, in the homelessness support scenario. And then we added 100 in the deeply affordable housing. So here we can see the outcome for, it's about 23 million over 10 years. For the experiencing homelessness, it's less for a better outcome. It's 20 million over 10 years for a better outcome. And then here, so we can see the kind of the best outcome to double the investment, but that's a $54 million investment over 10 years. So what looking at some of these different factors together allows you to do is weigh some of that cost benefit argument. Adaptations, almost done here. So because it's so flexible, there's a lot you can do. Can't do aliens descending to the earth, but you can make a lot of changes. So you can use it as a service provider to model your own program capacity, local governments to test options, nonprofits, if you're trying to build a case for support for future demand for homelessness housing. You can adjust the program types. We're working on right now where there'll be more supportive housing, mental health in it. You can customize the program lengths of stay. You can also just do it by population and combine it all. That's a little bit more arduous, but you can just look at family homelessness, youth, Indigenous, unsheltered populations. So there's different ways to kind of siphon off demographics. And then also what I've been thinking about is I'm pretty sure you can do it for anything. So it takes really thinking through the research on the assumptions and the model, but I think income assistance, childcare, like there are other topics I think it would lend itself to. And if you're exploring any of those, would love to kind of hear more. All right, how am I for time? 12:45, Q&A time. Let's stop my screen. Well, I'll wait to stop my screen. Any questions? Oh, there is questions. My team, my colleagues, do you have these written down?
There is a couple in the Q&A if you want to look, or I can read them out. And then
yeah, user error. Okay, it says, can you model the impact of population growth with different demographic ratios, gender, national versus, and cross-reference against average rental rates? Interesting. So smarter version than some of it we have in the model. Yes, you can definitely model the impact of population growth with different demographic ratios. And if you're modeling specific for need within those ratios, you're able to do it. Some of that, I would say, when I showed you the continuum of kind of napkin math versus sophisticated math model, it's a little bit closer to the sophisticated math model, but there are ways for us to take some of those assumptions and adjust the calculator for that. How do we incorporate the election cycle into this model? So I view the election cycle as kind of like aliens coming down. No, so it doesn't. So the only way for us to kind of look at the election cycle and how it's factored into the model is things like how might it impact population growth? How might it impact socioeconomic conditions will then impact the percentage of people at risk of homelessness? How might it impact the percentage of people who are converting from at risk to experiencing homelessness? So we would have to build kind of human logic assumptions on some of that, the changing conditions essentially. What criteria did you use for at risk of experiencing homelessness? Yeah. So what we did, we've done it different ways depending on what kind of our partners wanted. In the most recent one, our partners wanted at risk of experiencing homelessness as the percentage of population experiencing core housing need. And so I think that worked out roughly to about 11 or 10.5% of the population. And then we applied that across 10 years, but we could have changed it year to year as well. How do you incorporate maintenance and repairs and renovations? Really good question. So we're working with the community right now to use the modeling to inform, capital charges and looking at some of that. And that's one of the questions that has come up, both inflation and maintenance and repairs and renovations. It's not something we've added, but it's something we certainly could.
Jesse, I think there was another question. I'm not sure if you got to this one. It said, how do we incorporate the election cycles into this model, or do we use it to impact election results?
Yeah, so the model, the calculator doesn't. And what I would say about election cycles is we would look at how might the election cycles impact the inputs and the assumption in the model, and how would we have to adjust those. So that's what I was saying. It's more in the middle, not the sophisticated math model, but the kind of logic and human-led assumptions. How do you find hidden homelessness, couch surfing, living with parents? Yes. So you can decide what definition you want to include. What you need to identify is the number of people you think number of people in a year experiencing homelessness, and then the number of people at risk. You can choose whatever definition you want to be as expansive or as narrow in that number you decide for experiencing homelessness. So if you're a community with fewer people known to the system and you want to use that hidden homelessness number, you can. Within the model, the calculator itself, it doesn't tell you how many people are experiencing homelessness today. That's an input you have to decide. However, we have Help Seeker has some ways to estimate that and work through that if you have that missing data, or if you don't have that missing data. How much data entries to have a functional model? Okay, yeah. So we give communities basically a spreadsheet. It's low-key spreadsheet. It's not to ask for the inputs. We ask communities to go away and fill in as many inputs as they can, our partners. We come back, we look at those values together, we see if they pass the smell test, and then we also help them fill in everything. So something communities don't often have is acuity breakdown for the whole population experiencing homelessness, or may not know what their estimate of annual homelessness is. Then we work with them using some of our data, some of the more statistical methods to come up with an input that everybody feels comfortable with. So some communities honestly could get it back in a week. We've done it with large systems who've gotten it back kind of in 2. So yeah, it just depends. Sources of data, I can send you a spreadsheet, but the most important thing is your capacity in each program. You need to know how many spaces you have. It helps to know your average length of stay. Positive and negative exit rates we can estimate, or we can pick desired ones. Your operating and your capital costs per unit are helpful, but we also have kind of placeholders for that, and your number of people experiencing homelessness. And if you have that, there's a whole lot we can do. We calculate your population growth either using your local growth management strategy or other projections. And so again, there's a lot of data help seeker can supplement if you don't have it, but those are some of the kind of the main things you need. Counts from home. Is there a way to reflect inflation of design? Yes, there is. And Nicholas, if you want to help me figure that out, I would appreciate it. But I'm really sure there is, and I think that's one of the limitations we have now. We can apply it at the end, again, napkin math, but I think there could be an interesting way to apply a multiplier throughout the 10 years. Can help you develop outputs on what's needed for a community? Yes. Yes. If community is very limited, yes. We can, so Angela, just depending on the community and where you are, forgive me, I feel like your name looks familiar. There's data we can fill in, there's assumptions. Airdrie, yeah, okay, yes, we can. Thank you. Yeah, we would be able to do it. So yours is just starting for an assumption of 0 or limited, and then we could kind of model that through for sure. Thank you for the nice comments. Yes, tool of advocacy. So that is, I think, one of the main kind of usefulness of it. I'm losing it at this hour. The main utility of this kind of work, whether it's our tool or not, is showing those different scenarios, whether it's local advocacy community or other orders of government. And I know with the federal government, the intention to build a new ministry, are they calling it? But essentially for deeply affordable housing. I think the ability to show some of this and the impact it can have in your community in an evidence way, it is perhaps a position of strength. Yes, Tyler. So what we do, so the question is how are inputs changing year over year for at risk of homelessness, noting that this may change over time as a result of economic and other factors. So for at risk of homelessness, for all 10 years, you have to set an estimated percentage of what you think the total population at risk is. So what I do is in a situation where I think socioeconomic conditions are worsening or system's going to shit, then you can increase the total proportion of people within a population in a given year who you think are at risk of homelessness. So that's the best way I've found within the constraints of this to accommodate. No, it does not indicate the confidence interval for each scenario. And again, that really is because we're in the middle part of a tool that's customizable and usable for communities, not to the chagrin, I'm sure, of my data scientist colleagues, not in that machine learning, but we just found that data science work was not practical for communities to replicate, and it wasn't practical, frankly, for communities to resource. Are there can you please talk more about self-resolution and what proportion of outflow this might include? Yeah, I called a bunch of people. I called a bunch of smart people, and I said, if you had to pick a self-resolution rate, what would it be? In the most recent ones I've done, I set it at a 5%. Some research indicates that's higher. Some research indicates that's lower. So that's one of the flexible inputs that we walk through with community to say, here's your options. Here's what's backed by research. What do you think is most appropriate for your community? Is there any links to the type of research being done at the Santa Fe Institute on complex systems? Are there attempts to find strange attractors in this subsection of the socialist system or nonlinear nature of how these variables interact? Not the Santa Fe. I would love to research that. When we did the AMO work in partnership with OMSA and NASDA, we did look at the factors. We did do that machine learning model, and we looked at the factors that impact homelessness from the census data because we had a ton of census data to do that on. So would be happy to share that report and would love to hear more about that Santa Fe Institute piece. I think I got all of them with a few minutes to spare. Oh, Susan. Hey, Susan. Comment, not a question. A model that estimated need for shelter social transitional would be most helpful in scenario planning. If we do nothing, limited level of supports versus system of care. Yep. I totally agree, Susan. And I think the tool why we created does part of that. Not all of it, but I do think it effectively does part of that. Okay. Cool. Well, happy to chat to anyone about it. If you want a demo of it, if you want help thinking through if you're doing similar work, what factors you might want to include, yeah, would love to talk about it. It really is a labor of love. Right. Have a good day, guys.